You will do as I say.
But no, no.
Welcome to the Mech Story Porch. Let me tell you about Sophia Blackwell and the Duke of Ashford Manor, a man known only as Marcus Thorne. This is a story that begins with an ending, and ends with a beginning. Sophia Blackwell stood in the morning room of her father's townhouse, her hands trembling as she faced Richard Pemberton, a man twice her age with hands that felt like ice when they touched hers at last season's ball. "You will accept Mr. Pemberton's proposal," her father announced, his voice carrying the weight of financial desperation. "Our situation leaves no room for your romantic fantasies." But Sophia had seen the bruises on Richard Pemberton's late wife's arms in the portrait that hung in his study. She had heard the whispers from former servants who left his employment in the dead of night. "No," she said, the word falling like a stone into still water. "I will not." The slap came before she could brace herself. Her father's face twisted with something beyond anger. It was fear wearing the mask of rage. "Then you are no daughter of mine." Within a week, Sophia found herself in a boarding house in Bloomsbury, far from the elegant squares of her former life. The rooms were clean but cramped, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Patterson's baby crying 3 doors down. She took in sewing and mending, her fingers growing calloused as she worked by candlelight, stretching each penny until it screamed. 3 months passed like years. The knock came on a Tuesday evening, unexpected and firm. When Sophia opened the door, she found herself face to face with a man she'd seen only once before, at a distance, at her cousin's funeral 2 years prior. Marcus Thorne, the Duke of Ashford, cut an imposing figure even in the narrow hallway. Tall, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds, he carried himself with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to master every gesture, every expression. "Miss Blackwell," he said, his voice low and measured. "May I speak with you?" She should have refused. Propriety demanded it. But propriety had abandoned her the moment her father cast her out, so she stepped aside and let him enter. He stood in the center of her modest room, looking distinctly out of place among her meager possessions, like a thoroughbred in a stable meant for ponies. "I have a proposal," Marcus began without preamble. "Not of the romantic variety, I assure you. A business arrangement." Sophia remained standing, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. "I'm listening." "I require a wife." "You require security." "I propose a marriage of mutual convenience." He paused, measuring her reaction. "You would have financial stability, respectable position, and freedom to pursue your own interests within the bounds of discretion. I would have a duchess to manage my social obligations and silence the vultures who circle, waiting for me to produce an heir. And what would you require of me beyond social niceties?" Sophia asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Companionship at public events. Management of the household. Nothing more, unless you wished it." His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Was it loneliness? "I am not a romantic man, Miss Blackwell. My first wife died 8 years ago. I have no interest in love, only in practicality." Sophia studied him for a long moment. She thought of the calluses on her fingers, the ache in her back from hunching over needlework, the gnawing uncertainty of each tomorrow. "I accept," she said. Something in his posture relaxed, though his face remained impassive. "Then we shall marry within the month. But first, I think we should become better acquainted. I'll send a carriage for you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We'll take tea at my townhouse, properly chaperoned, of course. The carriage that arrived the next afternoon was elegant but understated, bearing the Ashford crest on its door. Sophia wore her best remaining dress, a simple grey wool that had seen better days but was at least clean and pressed. Marcus's London townhouse stood in Mayfair, a four-storey Georgian edifice that spoke of old money and older traditions. A butler with kind eyes admitted her, and she found Marcus waiting in a drawing-room that was surprisingly comfortable despite its grandeur. Books lined the walls, and a fire crackled in the hearth against the October chill. "Miss Blackwell," Marcus said, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming." An older woman sat in a chair by the window, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture impeccable. "This is my Aunt Josephine," Marcus said. "She's agreed to act as chaperone during our courtship, if we can call it that." Aunt Josephine's eyes twinkled with humor. "Marcus tells me you're a sensible girl." "Good. The last thing this family needs is more drama. We've had quite enough for several lifetimes." Over tea and delicate sandwiches, Marcus began asking questions. Not the superficial inquiries of polite society, but real questions. "What do you enjoy reading?" he asked. Sophia hesitated, then decided honesty was the best foundation for any arrangement, even a practical one. "Philosophy, mostly. And social reform treatises. I find Miss Martineau's work particularly compelling." Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "You're interested in social reform?" "I've always believed that those with means have an obligation to those without." She set down her teacup carefully. "Though I suppose my current circumstances make me something of a hypocrite." "Not at all," Marcus said firmly. "They make you someone who understands both sides of the divide. That's valuable." He paused. "At Ashford, I've been attempting to improve conditions for the tenant farmers, but I confess my efforts have been clumsy. Perhaps you'd have insights I lack." The afternoon passed more quickly than Sophia expected. They discussed estate management, the latest session of Parliament, and the growing Labour movement. Aunt Josephine interjected occasionally with dry observations that made Sophia laugh despite herself. When the carriage arrived to return Sophia to Bloomsbury, Marcus walked her to the door. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like to show you Ashford Manor. It will be your home, and you should see it before committing yourself." "I've already committed myself," Sophia reminded him. Nevertheless, his grey eyes met hers. "I want you to be certain." The journey to Hertfordshire the next day revealed a man Sophia hadn't expected. Marcus pointed out landmarks with the pride of someone who genuinely loved his land. He spoke of the village, the tenant families, the challenges of modernizing an estate steeped in tradition. "My father believed change was tantamount to betrayal," Marcus said as they approached the manor. "He ran Ashford as if it was still the 16th century. When I inherited, the place was bleeding money and morale." Ashford Manor rose from the countryside like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and towering chimneys. But as they drew closer, Sophia noticed the well-tended gardens, the fresh paint on the tenant cottages visible from the drive, the general air of prosperity. Mrs. Winters, the head housekeeper, greeted them with warmth that seemed genuine rather than rehearsed. The tour of the manor revealed rooms that were elegant but lived in, with books left open on side tables and fresh flowers in vases. "The east wing would be your domain," Marcus said, showing her a suite of rooms with windows overlooking the rose garden. "You'd have complete freedom to redecorate as you wish. I want you to be comfortable here." Sophia walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, imagining herself in these spaces. And where are your chambers? West wing, Marcus replied. But connected by the main gallery. I thought privacy seemed appropriate, given the nature of our arrangement. There was something in his voice, regret, perhaps, but before Sophia could analyze it, he was ushering her toward the library. The library stole her breath. 2 stories of books surrounded by a gallery with a wrought iron railing. A fire crackled in a massive hearth, and deep leather chairs invited reading. Oh, Sophia breathed, unable to contain her wonder. Marcus smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look years younger. I thought you might appreciate this room. It's my favorite place in the manor. You're welcome here anytime, of course. What's mine is yours. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a pattern. Marcus called on Sophia every other day, sometimes taking her to museums or exhibitions, other times simply walking through the parks as autumn painted London in shades of amber and rust. He told her about Catherine, his first wife, in carefully measured doses. How they'd been childhood friends who married young. How she'd been kind but never particularly interested in estate management or social reform. How he'd loved her in the comfortable way of long familiarity rather than passionate romance. I don't tell you this to compare, Marcus said one afternoon as they walked through Kensington Gardens. But because I want you to understand. I cared for Catherine deeply, but what I'm offering you is different. I won't pretend to feelings I don't have, but I promise you respect, partnership, and honesty. Sophia appreciated that honesty, even as part of her wished for something more. She told him about her own family, her mother's death when she was 12, her father's increasing desperation as investments failed, the suffocating pressure to save the family through marriage. She told him about Richard Pemberton's reputation, about choosing dignity over security. You were brave, Marcus said simply. I was terrified, Sophia corrected. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. 3 days before the wedding, Marcus took her to a jeweler in Hatton Garden. For the ring, he explained. I want you to choose something you actually like, not just accept whatever family heirloom gets pressed upon you. Sophia found herself drawn to a simple band with an emerald stone. It's beautiful, she murmured. Then it's yours, Marcus said, and when he slipped it onto her finger to check the fit, his touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary. That evening, over dinner at his townhouse with Aunt Josephine as ever-present chaperone, Marcus seemed unusually quiet. Is something wrong? Sophia finally asked. He set down his wine glass carefully. I want to make something clear before we marry. I know I said this arrangement would be purely practical, but... He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. I want you to know that if, in time, you wished for the marriage to be more complete, I would not be opposed. Heat flooded Sophia's cheeks. Aunt Josephine suddenly became very interested in her dessert. I don't expect anything, Marcus continued quickly. But I also don't want you to feel trapped in a half-marriage if you eventually desire otherwise. We can revisit the terms of our arrangement at any time. Sophia found her voice. And if you meet someone you wish to. I won't, Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. Whatever else this marriage is or isn't, I will honor my vows completely. I'm offering you the same freedom I'm denying myself, the choice to want more from this arrangement if you ever do. The night before the wedding, Sophia lay awake in her boarding house room, listening to the sounds of the city beyond her window. Tomorrow, she would become the Duchess of Ashford. She would leave behind this cramped room, a precarious existence, the constant fear of tomorrow. but she would also be binding herself to a man who offered respect and partnership but not love. A man who was courteous and considerate but who had carefully maintained an emotional distance even as they'd spent hours in each other's company. She thought of the way Marcus's eyes softened when he spoke of his tenants, the passion in his voice when he discussed social reform, the brief moment when his touch had lingered on her hand. She thought of his honesty, his integrity, the way he'd never once made her feel like a charity case despite their vastly different circumstances. Could she build a life with such a man? Could partnership be enough? In the darkness, Sophia decided it would have to be. Because the alternative was returning to this room, this uncertainty, this slow starvation of spirit and hope. Tomorrow, she would marry Marcus Thorne. And perhaps, in time, their careful arrangement might grow into something neither of them had planned for. The wedding took place in Ashford Manor's chapel on a November morning when frost painted the windows in crystalline patterns. Sophia wore a gown of ivory silk that Marcus had insisted on commissioning, and she carried a bouquet of white roses from the manor's greenhouse. Marcus stood at the altar in formal mourning dress, his expression unreadable until she began walking down the aisle. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but a softening, a warmth that made her breath catch. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. When Marcus placed the sapphire ring on her finger, his hand was steady, but she felt the slight tremor in his touch. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus's kiss was brief and chaste, but his eyes held something that looked almost like wonder. The wedding breakfast was attended by local gentry and a few of Marcus's closest associates. Sophia found herself accepted with surprising warmth, particularly by Lady Ashworth, the county's most formidable dowager. "Sensible girl," Lady Ashworth pronounced. "Just what Marcus needs. Too many years rattling around this manor like a ghost. High time he rejoined the living." As the guests departed and evening fell over Ashford, Sophia found herself alone in her new chambers, suddenly uncertain. What happened now? Did Marcus expect her to come to him? Would he come to her? A knock on the door answered the question. Marcus entered, still in his wedding clothes, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "I thought we should toast," he said, "to our arrangement." They sat by the fire in her sitting room, sipping champagne and talking about everything except what lay ahead. Marcus told her about the renovations he was planning for the East Tenant cottages. Sophia described her ideas for a lending library in the village. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, Marcus stood. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will be busy. Mrs. Winters will help you settle in properly." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Sophia, I want you to know. I'm grateful for your courage in accepting this arrangement. I'll do everything in my power to ensure you never regret it." After he left, Sophia changed into her nightgown and climbed into the enormous bed alone. It was, she reflected, exactly what she'd agreed to. So why did she feel such unexpected loneliness? The weeks that followed established their routine. Breakfasts together, where Marcus read his correspondence and Sophia planned her day with Mrs. Winters. Occasional dinners, where they discussed estate matters and current events. Afternoons where Sophia explored the manor and grounds while Marcus attended to business. He was courteous, always courteous. He ensured she had everything she needed, a generous allowance, access to the extensive library, freedom to redecorate as she wished. He consulted her on household decisions and actually listened to her suggestions. But he never touched her beyond the formal necessity of escorting her into dinner. He never visited her chambers after that first night. The emotional distance he'd promised remained firmly in place. Sophia threw herself into transforming the manor's charitable works. She established a program providing training and employment for young women from the village, teaching them skills that would ensure their independence. When she nervously presented the proposal to Marcus, expecting skepticism or dismissal, he merely nodded. "Excellent idea," he said. "How much additional funding do you need?" She named a figure she thought reasonable. He doubled it without hesitation. "If we're going to do this," he said, "let's do it properly." It was in these moments, when he showed unqualified support for her projects, when he defended her ideas to skeptical local gentry, when she caught him reading the social reform treatises she left lying about, that Sophia began to understand Marcus Thorne was a man of actions, not words. He showed his approval through allowances granted, through the way he listened when she spoke, through the new bookshelf that appeared in her sitting room stocked with volumes she'd mentioned wanting to read, through the greenhouse roses that appeared in her chambers weekly, though he never mentioned ordering them. But the distance remained, a chasm neither of them seemed willing to cross. Until the night of the winter ball. The annual Ashford Winter Ball was legendary throughout the county. Sophia had spent weeks preparing, determined to prove herself a worthy duchess despite the whispers about her reduced circumstances and hasty marriage. She descended the grand staircase in a gown of deep emerald silk, her mother's pearls at her throat, one of the few possessions she'd salvaged from her former life. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus waited, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw something crack in his carefully maintained composure. "You look," he began, then stopped, something raw and unguarded flashing across his face before he mastered it. "The emerald suits you." His hand trembled slightly as he offered her his arm, and Sophia felt something shift in her chest. The evening passed in a blur of introductions and dances. Sophia navigated the social waters with grace she didn't know she possessed, charming the county's most formidable matrons and parrying the subtle barbs of those who'd enjoyed seeing the Blackwell family fall. Marcus stayed close, his hand possessive at her back, his eyes following her even when duty required him to be across the room. When they danced together, a waltz that tradition demanded, he held her closer than strictly proper, and she could feel the tension in his frame. "You're doing wonderfully," he murmured as they turned. "I'm proud of you." The simple words hit Sophia with unexpected force. When had anyone last said they were proud of her? Then Richard Pemberton arrived, late and uninvited, his face flushed with wine and malice. "The runaway bride," he announced loudly, cutting through conversations like a knife. "Tell me, Your Grace, did you inform your husband about the scandal? About how your family begged me to take you off their hands?" The ballroom fell silent. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, Marcus was there, moving with the lethal grace of a predator. "Mr. Pemberton," Marcus said, his voice soft and infinitely dangerous, "you will leave my home. Now." "Or what?" Pemberton sneered. "Everyone knows this marriage is a sham. You, the cursed Duke, and your bought bride." He didn't finish. Marcus's fist connected with Pemberton's jaw with a crack that echoed through the ballroom. As Pemberton crumpled, 2 footmen appeared as if summoned by thought, dragging the man toward the door. Marcus turned to the assembled guests, his hands still clenched, blood on his knuckles. "Let me be clear. Anyone who questions my wife's honor questions mine. And I do not tolerate such questions." The silence stretched. Then Lady Ashworth, the county's most influential dowager, began to clap. Others joined her until the ballroom thundered with applause. But Sophia barely heard it. She saw only Marcus, the careful control shattered, something fierce and protective blazing in his eyes when he looked at her. That night, as the last guests departed, Sophia found herself unable to sleep. She wandered the gallery connecting their wings, pausing before a portrait of a young woman with kind eyes. "Catherine," Marcus's voice came from behind her. "My first wife." Sophia turned. He stood in the shadows, still in his evening clothes, his cravat loosened, his knuckles wrapped in bandages. "She died in childbirth," he continued, moving to stand beside her. "The physicians said nothing could be done." I held her hand as she slipped away, our son following her within hours. His voice remained steady, but Sophia heard the fractures beneath. "I swore I would never risk that pain again." "Is that why you wanted a marriage without love?" Sophia asked softly. "I thought I did." He finally looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his face stole her breath. "But somewhere between your first breakfast at my table and tonight, I realized I was a fool." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it cupped her cheek. "I am terrified, Sophia. Terrified of losing control, of wanting something so desperately that its loss would destroy me. But I find I am more terrified of living the rest of my life in this careful distance we've maintained." Sophia covered his hand with hers. "Then perhaps we should both be terrified together." When he kissed her, it was nothing like their wedding kiss. This was need and want and all the feelings they'd locked away, finally breaking free. Spring arrived at Ashford Manor like a promise kept. The gardens exploded with color, and Sophia, walking among the roses on an April morning, felt joy and terror warring in her chest. She was pregnant. Dr. Harrison had confirmed it that morning, his congratulations ringing in her ears as she tried to smile, tried to feel only happiness. But all she could think of was Catherine's portrait, of Marcus's haunted voice describing how he'd watched his first wife die. For 2 days, she said nothing, watching Marcus across the breakfast table, memorizing the way he smiled now when he saw her, the way he reached for her hand as they walked, the way he'd shed his careful control and allowed himself to simply be with her. On the 3rd day, Marcus found her in the library, staring at a book she hadn't turned a page of in an hour. "Sophia," he said, settling beside her on the window seat. "Whatever it is, tell me." So she did, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm pregnant. I'm carrying our child, and I'm terrified because I see it in your eyes every time you look at me lately, that shadow of fear, and I know you're thinking of Catherine, and I don't know how to give you this news without it also feeling like I'm handing you your worst nightmare." The silence that followed felt eternal. Then Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I need to propose something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you respond." Dread flooded through her. "Marcus, I think," he interrupted, still not turning, "that you should go to the London townhouse for your confinement. My aunt will accompany you. You'll have the best physicians, every comfort." He paused. "And I will remain here." The words hit like physical blows. "You want us to live separately? I want you safe." Now he turned, and she saw the agony in his face. "I want you to have every advantage, every possible chance." "And I?" His voice broke. "I cannot watch it happen again, Sophia. I cannot stand beside another bed, holding another hand, watching the light leave the eyes of someone He stopped, pressing his palm against his forehead. "I am a coward. I know this. But I cannot do it again." Sophia stood, her hands instinctively covering her still flat stomach. Something cold and final settled in her chest. You don't have to, she said quietly. I'll go to London. I'll have the baby there. And after? She took a shaky breath. After, we can discuss more permanent arrangements. Sophia, no, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. She moved past him toward the door, then paused. You talk about losing Catherine as though she was something you possessed. But love isn't about possession, Marcus. It's about being brave enough to stand beside someone through everything, even the terrifying parts. Especially the terrifying parts. She left him standing in the library, and she did not look back. The London townhouse felt like a gilded cage. Marcus's Aunt Josephine was kind, fussing over Sophia with genuine affection, and Dr. Chambers, who attended her, was the finest physician in London. But none of it mattered because Marcus wasn't there. He wrote. Every week, letters arrived with the Ashford seal, inquiring after her health, informing her of manor business, his handwriting growing more erratic with each correspondence. She read them once, then filed them away, unanswered. Her body changed, her belly swelling with life, and she felt achingly alone. You should write to him, Aunt Josephine ventured one afternoon as they took tea. The boy is torturing himself. He made his choice, Sophia replied, but her hand rested on her belly, where the baby kicked as if in protest. The weeks passed. Summer arrived, hot and stifling in London. Sophia's program for training young women had expanded, and she threw herself into the work, meeting with prospective employers, reviewing applications, anything to keep her mind from wandering to Hertfordshire and the man she'd left there. Then, in late July, Aunt Josephine came to her sitting room with an expression that made Sophia's heart stutter. He's here, she said simply. Arrived an hour ago, looking like death warmed over. He's in the study, and he says he won't leave until you speak with him. Sophia's first instinct was to refuse. But the baby kicked hard, as if urging her forward, and she found herself descending the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister for support. Marcus stood by the window, his back to the door. He'd lost weight, she noticed, his clothes hanging differently on his frame. When he turned at the sound of her entrance, she saw the shadows under his eyes, the lines bracketing his mouth. Sophia, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. You shouldn't have come, she replied, hating how much she'd missed that voice. I had to. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if remembering he'd forfeited the right to close the distance. I've been the worst kind of fool. These months apart, Sophia, they've been hell. And I realized something. What? She asked, her hand unconsciously covering her belly. Living without you, wondering every moment if you're well, if you're safe, if you're happy, it's worse than any fear I've carried about losing you. He moved closer now, close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes. I've been so terrified of grief that I've guaranteed it by sending you away. If something happens, his voice broke. If the worst comes, I want to be there. I want to hold your hand. I want to be the last person you see, not some hired physician in a house that isn't home. Tears spilled down Sophia's cheeks. You can't just show up and say these things. I love you, he interrupted, the words bursting out like they'd been locked inside too long. I have loved you since that winter ball, maybe before. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you've transformed Ashford into a home instead of a mausoleum. I love the way you argue with me about estate management and the way you fall asleep reading in the library and the way you've made me remember what it feels like to be alive instead of merely existing. He dropped to his knees before her, his hands hovering near her belly but not quite touching, asking permission. I love you, and I love this child, and I am begging you to come home. Not to the townhouse, not to some comfortable distance, but home. To Ashford. To our bed and our life and our future, however long or short it may be. Sophia covered his hands with hers, pressing them against her belly where the baby kicked. "You're an idiot," she whispered. "I know. You broke my heart. I know." His voice was wrecked. "But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness." She pulled him to his feet, or tried to. The bulk of her pregnancy made her clumsy. He rose, steadying her, and they stood there, tears on both their faces. "I love you too," Sophia said. "I've loved you since you punched Richard Pemberton in defense of my honor, maybe before. And I'm terrified too, Marcus. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." When he kissed her, it tasted of salt and second chances. Sophia returned to Ashford Manor in August, and Marcus didn't leave her side except when absolutely necessary. He held her hand during the long evening walks Dr. Chambers prescribed. He read to her when she grew too uncomfortable to sleep. He told her stories of his childhood, of Catherine with fondness instead of guilt, of the future he wanted to build. When the labor pains began on a September morning, as the first leaves were turning gold, Marcus was there. And when Sophia, gripping his hand hard enough to leave marks, looked at him with fear in her eyes, he leaned close and whispered, "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. You're the strongest person I've ever known, and you can do this." 10 hours later, as the sun set over Ashford's grounds, their daughter came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious at the indignity of birth. Dr. Chambers placed the baby in Marcus's arms while he tended to Sophia, and Marcus stared down at the tiny, perfect face, tears streaming unchecked down his cheeks. "She's beautiful," Sophia whispered, exhausted but alive, wonderfully alive. "You're beautiful," Marcus replied, moving to sit beside her on the bed, their daughter cradled between them. "You're both beautiful, and you're both mine, and I am the luckiest man who ever drew breath." They named her Catherine Sophia Thorne, honoring the past while embracing the future. On a spring afternoon, with Catherine toddling through the manor's gardens chasing butterflies, Sophia and Marcus sat on the terrace watching their daughter's joy. "Your father sent another letter," Marcus said carefully. "Asking to visit, to meet Catherine." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Since Catherine's birth, her father had written several times, his letters growing increasingly humble, even contrite. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that people can change. I think that we all deserve the chance to make amends for our mistakes." He took her hand. "I also think that he hurt you deeply, and you owe him nothing. The decision is entirely yours." Sophia watched Catherine, who had discovered a ladybug and was squealing with delight. "I think I'd like to try," she said finally. "Not for him, but for her. And maybe." She turned to Marcus. "Maybe for me too. To show myself that I've healed enough to extend grace." Marcus kissed her temple. "Then we'll try. Together." As the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that desperate boarding house room to this moment of perfect, ordinary happiness. She thought about how close they'd come to losing everything by trying to protect themselves from loss. How love required courage, the kind that made you stand steady even when every instinct screamed to run. Their story hadn't been easy. It had been messy and painful and marked by mistakes. But it had been theirs, and it had been true, and in the end, that was what mattered. Dear listener, as we close this chapter of Sophia and Marcus's story, I leave you with this truth: love is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand firm in the face of it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe to Mech's Story Porch, and leave a comment telling us about a time you chose courage over fear. Your stories inspire us, and they remind others they are not alone.